What's the fastest way you've seen a CEO ruin a company? A construction company near me was pulling 100 to 200 million in revenue every year and growing constantly. Then the owner died and his frat bro fail son was handed the reins. Within a month, a quarter of the employees had either been fired or quit. After 4 months, the rental companies were showing up and repoing lifts and cranes/carry decks in the middle of the day because they weren't being paid. Almost three-fourths of the employees had quit by this point because paychecks kept bouncing. Before 6 months had passed, what was left was sold for a pittance to another company that just wanted what was left of the maintenance contracts. So, like 6 months to bomb the company he'd been groomed to take over since he was a teenager to rubble and piss on the ashes. Story 2. Knew a guy that was handed the family manufacturing business when his uncle died. He quickly found out why his cousins didn't want it. He was suddenly holding the bag on a couple million in debt that everyone but him knew about. He hired someone to run the business for him while he worked a second job to cover the salary of the manager. He got the business turned around and out of debt in a couple years. Suddenly, all of his cousins were clamoring for a piece of the business, saying that their dad meant for them to have it all along. In the end, he sold it to them for a pittance just to avoid a legal fight over his dead uncle's will. The first thing his cousins did? Fired the manager. Within a year, they took the company that had dug itself out of millions in debt and put it right back into debt. They ended up selling off all their equipment to their dad's most hated competitor. Yeah, I can't stand to see vultures like this in the business place. Glad that once they got the business back, they ultimately drove it right back into the ground and have nothing to show for it. That's pretty crappy. Story 3. Sears and Kmart are just so interesting. Sears owned so much real estate. They were basically a real estate company that was also a department store. When venture capital took it over, the first order of business for them was selling all of that real estate and then making their stores pay rent to stay on the property they used to own outright. Had they kept the property, they could have operated at a profit even in down economies, but instead they could barely make rent and gutted their workforce to keep up. The store quality tanked due to being drastically understaffed, and they could barely stock the shelves, leading one of the largest retailers in history at the time to quickly become a shell of its former self. The dumbest part of all is the timing of it. When this took place, the real estate market was not doing well, so the value of the property they sold was far lower than what it would have been just a decade later. They literally bought high, sold low, and effed themselves out of business that, had it just kept what it owned, would today be one of the largest property-owning retailers in the US, if not the world. Venture capital is a effing plague. Story 4. Took a job at a tech startup in the 90s with the promise of fast growth and opportunity. Things really took off in the second year, and we opened up several more branches in different states while I was promoted to production manager. The company hired a young CEO who was only a couple years older than me. Sometimes he would stay at our location for a couple of weeks at a time, and he started driving really nice sports cars to work. When he would leave to other cities, he would leave his cars in the parking lot of our branch. There were Corvettes, Porsches, Audis, and more. After the second year of promising growth, the business suddenly stopped while the owners visited and yelled at the entire crew for not managing our money and told us that they were in debt by over $1 million. We were all given the task of dismantling the equipment and preparing it to be sold and shipped before letting it go. On our last day, when the building was empty, we all noticed that the row of sports cars was still there, and the owner had placed for sale signs on them. It turned out that they were all bought as company vehicles, and the CEO had done this at each business location. We all still were yelled at in a furious rage by the CEO and owner for not being responsible people. Story 5. Just saw in the news a Texas logistics company CFO was sentenced to 51 months in prison for wire fraud for transferring company funds to his bank account and destroying the company, causing it to shut down and lay everyone off. The kicker is, he was convinced of the same felony in 1994, so it was the second time he'd done it. Story 6. Randall Stevenson, AT&T. He bought DirecTV and Warner Brothers, including DC Comics, CEN, HBO, and so on, for only $175 billion between 2015 and 2018. When everyone was moving to stream services, he thought it was a good idea to buy a cable company that was losing customers by millions and a struggling media company. Me and thousands of people lost their job because of it, including Randall, with a $64 million retirement package. Well, unlike UOP, I think Randall Stevenson's going to be A-OK sitting on money like that. Hate to hear it for the workers further down the employment line, but yeah, that's just kind of the world we live in, and the future is definitely in streaming devices. Story 7. He tried to run a non-profit library wholesaler like a car dealership, because he was a car dealership guy who knew F all about libraries. Most of the senior staff retired, and he fired the rest, then implemented policies that treated us all like children, such as having to put our phones in a box at the front office when we got into work in the morning. Hired a bunch of rando high-level positions who also knew F all about libraries. Then he talked some crap about people who, quote, couldn't handle change because they'd quit. Refused to allow us to order inventory so libraries couldn't get extra copies when a book unexpectedly blew up. Anyway, I quit when I was handed a coworker's entire job with no extra compensation, or, choice in the matter, and the 60-plus-year-old company was dead within about a year and a half of him becoming CEO. Story 8. I worked for Sears in my 20s. I was the warehouse supervisor for 3 years during the time when he was cutting costs. At the time in Wyoming, we were employing people for $10 an hour. It wasn't a lot, but we could get decent employees. Head management docked their pay to a measly $6.50 an hour and forced me to fire 2 people, get rid of all 4 of our storage trailers, and significantly reduced on-hand merchandise. People can just order items and pick them up later, I was told. Half of our warehouse staff quit, understandably, and we hired on 4 kids, 2 of which were probably on meth. One of them was fired after we found out he stole like $5,000 worth of TVs. Another kid was literally taking boxes of clothing that were shipped to us and throwing them into the dumpster because he didn't want to process them. No one gave a crap about that job, and I couldn't blame them. Because of lack of storage, we were stacking washers, dryers, sometimes fridges, freezers, and lawnmowers dangerously high. This caused many to get damaged, so even the merchandise that we had on hand would be returned. When faced with a 2 or 3 week waiting time, most customers decided to go somewhere else to buy their appliances and electronics. The floor of the store was reduced to a skeleton of what it once was. It was seriously just sad. I ended up leaving because my big payoff for dealing with immensely incompetent corporate leadership was a whopping 4-cent raise after 2 years of no raises or bonuses. I just stopped showing up. I was told I should be happy because not many people actually got a raise. Story 9. Michael Lyon, CEO and owner of Lyon Real Estate in Sacramento. This was his father's company, but he was able to really expand the company and the brand. They were an anomaly in the real estate world in that they were a family-owned company but dominated the Sacramento region, until his divorce from his wife, where she went public and to the FBI, with the videos Michael had been surreptitiously recording of their guests in the bedroom and bathroom. That was pretty darn bad, but when cops went in to make the bust, they found him secretly recording himself with a prostitute, and then the meth came onto his scene. It was amazing to see this man's downfall in real time. Story 10. Whoever decided no adult content on Tumblr. Want it or not, Tumblr was a center point for artists of all kinds, and lots would do kinky stuff. And when they went for it, they went hard. Like a bot would go through and ban you if it found something a little too sexy. Traffic on Tumblr dropped by like 50% in a month. Story 11. Go Bear in Asia. The company got funded for 200 million euros in 5 years. Best funded company in Southeast Asia at the time. Got a new CEO who fired every single board member and member of the executive team that didn't agree with him. Kept all the yes sir, C-level, and directors. In 2 years, the company went down the drain and closed. At its peak, it had over 200 employees. The best part of it? He made the company buy a money-lending business in the Philippines that he owned. So he pocketed whatever money the company had left and then shut it down. Story 12. David Zaslav and Discovery Channel buying Warner Media. Canceled highly anticipated movies already made, watered down HBO Max with cheap Discovery trash, and instituted RTO and fired anyone who couldn't. He also called The Flash the greatest superhero movie he had ever seen and put a ton of PR in capital, despite Ezra Miller's previous international crime spree and numerous scandals. He even pulled Westworld completely from HBO Max after canceling it abruptly even though it had been previously renewed, and put it on Tubi. More recently, he's so profit-hungry and wants to rush every piece of IP they have, he abruptly cut off a couple of episodes from the most recent season of House of the Dragon, right as they were going into production. It left the finale in a really terrible spot because there's no payoff to what the writers are building on earlier in the season. In next season for House of the Dragon, which is the next part of the book the source material is drawn from, are full of very expensive set pieces. The writers pushed some stuff the last season, and now a lot of it is going to have to go into season 3 to pace properly. The problem is that instead of giving his most expensive 2 IPs freedom to do as many episodes as needed, he's only giving them 8. I genuinely have no idea how they'll pull it off, given the corner they've written themselves into, and with the cost-cutting constraints. Effing hate that guy. He's ruined so much about Warner Brothers, and he cannot be fired and banished from the entertainment industry soon enough. This is incredibly annoying. I completely agree that when just strictly for financial reasons, people like this compromise the quality of shows that have such great potential, whether canceling them while they're still just like burning hot with popularity, or in the case of House of the Dragon, like they're saying, like cutting episodes, cutting content, and just removing battles and set pieces altogether. So the product sucks, but man, you're saving money, right? Terrible. Story 13. It's called the Osborne effect. Once the owner of a hugely successful computer company, Adam Osborne announced a new computer before it could be shipped. According to proponents of the Osborne effect theory, Adam Osborne damaged his company's current sales when he began showing the Osborne executives to journalists in early 1983. Dealers rapidly started canceling orders for the Osborne 1 in anticipation of the new executive. Unsold inventory piled up, and in spite of dramatic price cuts, the Osborne 1 was selling for $1,295 in July 1983 and $995 by August. Sales did not recover. Losses, already higher than expected, continued to mount, and OCC declared bankruptcy on September 13, 1983. Story 14. Bob Chapek's takeover of Disney in 2019. He immediately hired finance buddies into creative positions, prioritized making money via their parks, and had a quantity over quality approach with their movies. He had a hand greenlighting an insane amount of projects, which led to overworked staff, bad quality production, and as a result, disliked projects and failing entertainment properties, mainly Marvel. Story 15. For a more serious example, there's the whole thing with the U.S. Firearms Company and the Zip-22. U.S. Firearms Company was a relatively small gun manufacturer. They were certainly never on the same scale as the likes of Colt or FN, but they were reasonably successful, and did find a niche for making what were, and still are, considered very high-quality reproductions of the Colt single-action Army revolver. And then, for some inexplicable reason, the CEO decided to toss it all away in favor of his brainchild, the Zip-22. A pistol that's generally considered to be one of the worst firearms ever made. Not only is it an extremely unreliable gun that's extremely prone to jamming, even if the thing works perfectly, the Zip-22 is extremely awkward to hold from an ergonomics perspective. And on top of that, it's also one of the most blatantly unsafe firearms ever made, since cocking the gun requires the user to place their finger directly in front of the barrel. The Zip-22 was such an absolute disaster of a firearm that just a year after it had been released, the company was forced to shut down in its entirety. Forgotten Weapons does a fairly in-depth video about all of its myriad of issues in this video for anyone that wants to learn more about it. Story 16. Not a CEO situation, but a district manager losing about 30 years worth of sales experience over a 1-month period. Worked at a cell phone store. We were in a great mall, and we were the best in the district. The worst location was in a perceivably better mall. The district manager decided that he was going to transfer the entire staff between the two malls, as if it wasn't the people that were the problem at the crappy location. Several of us objected to this move, and we were told, and I quote, "If I tell you to jump, you will say how high." One guy walked out on the spot, leaving with 5 years' experience. Within 3 days of the move, our best guy quit the company. 8 years of experience gone. A week later, I quit, taking my 6 years of experience with me. About another week later, the last remaining guy and the manager both quit the same day for a total of 11 years more experience. Our original store predictably tanked and became the worst store. The better mall store remained empty for a few months. About 6 months after, I passed my original store and it had closed down. I don't know if they relocated, but it was no longer there. It was one of those generic, we sell every carrier companies. Story 17. A CIO came in and started his tenure off with telling everyone his second week there on a Friday that starting Monday, there was absolutely no working from home. Nada, zilch, no excuses. HR got involved and made it even clearer. This was before COVID, and it was working from home 3 days a week. Some people had moved 2+ hours away, would come into town Monday morning, stay the night, work Tuesday, and go home to work until the next Monday. Well, in IT, it's not very prudent to have your guys be able to hop on to fix a problem. So the CIO would try to make the exemption in special cases, and no one would budge. So the few times some people went in, a 10-minute fix would run them 3 to 4 hours. The CIO also had a knack of yelling at people in public and just being a huge dumb F and not knowledgeable about anything. He took a 15-year secretary and made her an enterprise back-end developer that she never wanted. He took an amazing developer and assigned them one of 58 sites for a pet project where we would start pulling data without the site's permission. The site told them to F off when they realized what was going on after a few months. The thinly spread developer led to a site getting hacked and held for ransom, literally. And that's just before I left. In 2 years, the place had a 50% plus turnover. The old-timers who wrote the old-ass code keeping the place running took early retirement. Middle careers like myself effed off. Everyone else was just new, looking for experience, or holding on for early retirement. That place cratered. From some colleagues who stayed, I heard people were often crying in the hallways. They had to hire a moral boosting position that did jack crap. Federal requirements were falling through left and right, and the agency was getting sanctioned repeatedly. Eventually, the board wiped out the entire top brass of about 10 people in a 200-person agency. But the damage was done, and to this day, crap still hasn't recovered. I know people who took 40K pay cuts for other jobs just to get the F out of that place. Story 18. How about Chainsaw Al Dunlap? They called him Chainsaw because he'd take over a company and cut it up into pieces. He took over Sunbeam and bankrupted it in an elaborate accounting scandal. He's on the list of worst CEOs of all time. Look him up. It's an interesting read. Story 19. Taking the profits from one business unit and continuously funneling more money and resources into the other unit who, years later, still weren't profitable. Also, RIFing out top performers from the profit unit. The board finally caught on, and that CEO was exited, but not before death spiraling the entire company. Story 20. My personal experience was a new manager that stopped all overtime. I was trying to keep customers happy, and he was not for it. The overtime is an indication that we needed more people. He couldn't see it. I left, and they folded. Story 21. Ruin is a strong word, but it wasn't good. Small company wanted to be bigger and have bigger customers. Owners hired a CEO with experience in that. CEO did classic corporate CEO crap, which didn't jive well because the company had been very employee first, very transparent, and a good place to work. Took about 18 months and they fired the guy and the owner stepped back in. Story 22. Not a CEO, but working in a small female-dominated business. The new owner decided he was canceling the flexible contracts that allowed people wiggle to for school drop-off/kid sick days and the like. The company had to shut for 2 weeks after the majority of the staff swapped to a competing business in the next suburb. Place never really picked up again after word got around town. One of the ladies put in a good word for me a few months later, and an offer to sign a substantial pay increase and better conditions appeared in my inbox. Story 23. Buy Twitter. Introduce payment for verification. Unban white supremacists and conspiracy theorists, causing a meteoric rise in white supremacists and conspiracy theorists. Remove the ability to block any of it, thus reducing the ability to curate one's feed and enabling stalking and harassment. Turn the company into blatant propaganda rag for the CEO's personal agenda and ego, forcing himself and his views into every crack and orifice in the website, and making it infinitely more biased than he claims Twitter ever was. Call it X of all things. Say what you want to make it an everything app. Meanwhile, 2+ years in, and it's still functionally just Twitter. Story 24. Probably when a CEO comes in and tries to cut costs by laying off the people who actually know how to run the business. Like, they save money short term, but lose all the talent and experience, and the whole thing falls apart. Also, when they make some wild pivot into a market they don't understand. Instant disaster. So we're going to harp on the point again. What's more important, money or quality of product/service? And I completely agree with this story. You can't be in business if your product is not good. Story 25. Hasbro has been doing everything in its power to destroy the Dungeon and Dragon band. Oddly, not the first time D&D has been helmed by a CEO who steered the ship into the very avoidable rocks. In the late 1980s, the company, TSR, was run by Lorraine Williams. Problem was, she apparently detested RPGs and the people who played them, and spent a sizable chunk of the company's resources trying to shift away from RPGs to secure a customer base she thought was more prestigious. Just a lack of vision and poor understanding of the company customer base that we sometimes see, and it never ends well. The company's profits began to slip badly from these unwanted products she demanded, and then came along WOTC with their Magic the Gathering collectible card game to shove TSR aside in the world of nerd biz. Thinking she could get in on some similar sort of collectible-centered game, she gambled the company's dwindling resources on a massive production of a game called Dragon Dice that centered on collectible dice. TSR produced huge sums of these games with expansion packs. Well, nobody bought them. TSR was out of money and couldn't pay their bills. They couldn't even print or ship their D&D products because they had no money, and thus no way to even earn any more. WOTC bought them out for a fraction of their old value. Story 26. Good old Big Jim came in on the promise to shareholders he would double the profits in less than a year, and that he did. First, forced retirements for anyone there over 15 years. Get rid of those high salaries and institutionalized knowledge, but who cares about that? Second, cancel all capital projects. Why build out when customers are kind of forced to buy from us anyway? Third, RTO all around. Even said in a Teams meeting, from his comfy home office, of course, if you don't like it, leave. 35% of us left. Company is barely hanging on, and it's well known they're positioning themselves to get sold. Story 27. New CEO was told to cut costs and commence the most aggressive cost-cutting program ever seen in our company's history. So much so, we started hemorrhaging revenue, which led him to cut costs even more aggressively. In the space of 2 years, we'd lost a heap of market share. We went from being a very profitable company to one with a sharp drop in ROE. And by the time he was fired for doing his business manager in his office, the business needed substantial investment to bring all its systems back up to standard and to hire good staff again. Market share never recovered, and the business is still worse off than when he started a decade ago. Story 28. Research in Motion actually had a copy of the iPhone almost a year before its release. They thought it was hilarious. Like, it had so much functionality to it that it burned through all of its data in like an hour. Their phones, on the other hand, were slim and managed data much better. What they didn't know was that AT&T was secretly building the world's largest and most powerful data network specifically for being the executive provider of this phone. Story 29. The CEO of Hoover decided on a ridiculous giveaway with the purchase of a new vacuum. They were giving away airline tickets worth more than the price of the vacuum. Everyone told him it was going to flop and cost the company millions more than the revenue it would bring in. He stuck to his guns and then tried to cancel the whole thing at the last minute. This was in 1992 in the UK, and if one spent 200 British pounds of Hoover stuff, they would get an airline ticket worth 600 pounds. Story 30. My dad spent 35 years starting and building his business, hugely profitable by the end and a place people wanted to work. He wanted to retire, so he sold it. Within 3 months, almost everyone had left because they were being treated like crap to maximize profits. 6 months in, during the peak season when my dad would normally have to turn away work, they had employees without work to do. 1 year from purchase and they closed the business. I couldn't believe how quickly it could collapse. Story 31. First Public Bank. The CEO/founder had no succession plan because he planned to live forever. He also planned that the interest rates would be low forever, not reality, and assumed massive but unnecessary duration risk for the bank portfolio, believing there would never be a rainy day. Well, a rainy day came, and the bank to the wealthy collapsed, 30 plus years down the tubes in a week. Ego is a killer. Story 32. Company in the early 90s was a moderately successful manufacturer of network equipment for Macs. Not nearly as big as the dominant player in the market, but doing a respectable business and growing. CEO buys an HP 95LX, an early personal information manager, or gets one for Christmas, and decides to pivot the company to write software to synchronize the calendar and contacts stored on this thing with the Mac. So he bet the company on a niche product for early adopters on the also-ran, though admittedly superior, operating system. So a market size of maybe 1,000 customers in 1991 and a price of like $99 a pop? Genius move. Last I heard, he fled to Hong Kong with the IRS on his tail. Story 33. Not CEO, but president and especially vice president of the company. Big Motor. President of the company placed his son as vice president and profits skyrocketed, but only because, as it turned out, new vice president forced dealerships to commit insurance fraud, regular fraud, abused and humiliated the staff, killed all the plant life around leadership. After it got out, reputation of the company was completely destroyed, despite them being the biggest and most trusted dealership before that. Story 34. Not me, but a friend of mine is a effing corporate management wizard, to the point that he's hired to tell companies how to fix their crap. Most of his clients go bankrupt or get sold off for the pennies within 2 years of his contract to end because they either refuse to make the changes he lays out, or they hire someone to run the company after making all the changes, and their new management axes all of it for a lean system. Effectively, he recommends to take most of the profit margin and divide it into employee retention / hiring and reinvestment for equipment replacement, upgrades, facility improvements, expansion, and generally at a 50-50 ratio. But there are specifics as to how to maximize it, and that's where the wizard part comes in. Any and every company that actually followed his plan and stuck with it succeeded, which is why he's always in demand. The problem is, most, and by most I mean something like 80% of the companies, don't. Cue one such company. Old man who had built the entire operation dies. Kids can't be bothered to run it because they have more important things to do, so they hire me and my friend to tell them how to turn it into an intaglio press. He goes through everything, spends something like 6 months on it, and gives them a detailed plan. Detailed down to who to hire to run it for them. They nod their empty heads and promptly hire one of their friends from high school to be the CEO. New CEO tells him his report is effing nonsense and tries to refuse the final payment for the contract they had with my friend. 4 months later, it was dissolved. Less than a year after that guy's death, the company he spent his life building did not exist. But my friend did get his last payment from the bankruptcy court, and the CEO got caught drunk with an underage prostitute at a DUI checkpoint shortly after. Story 35. There is an auto supplier that dated back to the 1800s called Federal Mogul. In the late 90s, the CEO at the time made 2 small acquisitions. It just so happened that those 2 small companies ended up having some asbestos liabilities. Even though they eventually resold those businesses, the liabilities stuck to Federal Mogul, and they were bankrupted by it in 2001. Story 36. Not nearly as high profile as a lot of what was posted here, but a couple of years back, I worked for a small, single-product manufacturer who were trying to get approval for it to be used as a medicine. 6 months into my contract, I was a contractor, this is outside the US, it was surprisingly bought out by a US-based mid-size food manufacturer. We met our new customers, and one of them shook me by the hand, telling me how much we'd all be needed over the next years as they bought the product to market. Next day, they terminated my contract as non-essential staff. On the one hand, I was a contractor and crap like that can happen. On the other, F those guys a month before Christmas. 2 months later, the site was shut down with the loss of about 60 jobs. Why? Because the idiots had no idea of the regulatory process of bringing an API, active pharmaceutical product, to market. That was easily $200 million straight down the drain. Story 38. My dad worked for a smaller family-owned company, but they did very well. Before 2008, my dad tried to warn his childhood best friend, the new CEO, that the market wasn't looking great, and that he needed to chill out on all the cocaine and hookers or he was going to end up losing everything. He got offended and fired my dad. Then, months later, he ended up losing the company. He had blown excessive amounts of money on drugs, quit caring about much of anything, and then, when the economy collapsed, he was not prepared, so he lost the entire company, and ended up getting sued for a lot of money. Story 39. Decided that owning a live music venue would be more exciting than a fastener company. That's not how he presented it, however. He was going to move them to just-in-time manufacturing to reduce their reliance on expensive warehousing. The fact that the company warehouse was going to be redeveloped into a site-of-the-art music experience was just his way of giving back to the community. Labor costs doubled, and the sales department went from, "You can have them this afternoon if you send someone over, otherwise we'll deliver them in the morning," to, "Sorry, it'll be 30 days, and there's a minimum order of $50K. They went bankrupt inside of 9 months. Karmic justice was sweet, though. His first partner in the music venue fled the country with a pile of stolen cash from investors. When he submitted for planning permission, the NIMBY's name came out of the woodwork. And his second partner put the nails in the coffin when he decided to go ahead and, quote, spruce the place up and do a soft open by tearing out a crap ton of asbestos and holding an illegal rave where 2 kids overdosed. What a mess. What an absolute mess. Karmic justice, as OP put it, definitely was sweet to read here, but man, like people like this, you often wonder like how'd they even get in a position of authority in the first place. Story 40. Dig.com. Dig was far superior to Reddit in the early days. Reddit was primitive, smaller user base, dull content. In fact, Reddit may not have even existed during the early Dig days. Dig had the early Web 2.0 feel. Bigger user base, better content. It was just a better site. Dig had its problems, like power users influencing content popularity, but the site was on track to be a behemoth, the way Reddit and other huge socials are today. In 2010, Dig released a new version of the site where they completely changed how it works, for the worse. You can read it up on social media. The revamp completely ruined the site, and it has never recovered. I can say with some confidence that many Reddit users never would have made accounts here if not for the downfall of Dig. I believe Reddit would be a shadow of its current popularity if Dig just kept doing what they were doing. Of course, with continual improvements along the way, like decreasing the impact of power users. Story 41. I watched the owner of a place I work at turn a big facility that was designed and laid out to service many clients, third-party logistics, turn the entire building into one client. I expressed my concerns about this as if that client ever pulls out, there will be zero work and everyone will be let go. Fast forward 1.5 years later, and that client pulled out. Everyone was laid off and I was the last one standing. The company is now gone. This is what happens when you hire family members that have no clue what they're doing, have no business background, and put them into the highest positions. Story 42. For me, it's Michelle Gass, former CEO of Kohl's. Before her, Kohl's was a fun place to work. Everyone got along, sales were booming, and Black Fridays were huge events. Then she said she didn't want stores to carry large amounts of inventory, which is fair, but they overdid it. There were large empty spaces at most stores and noting in the stock rooms. Then came the Amazon deal. Kohl's would take in Amazon returns in the hope of increasing sales. They gave every person that returned Amazon items an in-store coupon. However, people who shop Amazon don't care about Kohl's. They can get it cheaper on Amazon. Part of this deal was that Kohl's used its distribution system to ship Amazon packages back to Amazon. The sales didn't even make up a part of the expenses. Amazon really won that one. Then, during COVID, she cut 90% of the loss prevention staff, which, you guessed it, resulted in record inventory losses. It wasn't heard of for 10% inventory losses compared to sales. I had a few stores that hit over $1 million in lost inventory. What did they do with the remaining loss prevention staff? They made them door greeters, which resulted in people leaving the company. Then, throughout COVID, Kohl's was one of those companies that should have profited massively. They had a large distribution chain and online sales, yet they closed down storability for online sales and only used specific stores. Kohl's is now in the beginning stages of becoming Sears. Story 43. There's a locally owned greenhouse/orchard business in my town that had been around for 105 years. The owner handed the business over to his son, who then proceeded to hire some skank, started sleeping with her, then put her in charge of the day-to-day operations, which caused a bunch of the workers to quit. Then he was arrested 6 times in a 3-year span for DUIs, resisting arrest, damage to private property, and failure to appear. Shortly thereafter, the place was gutted and sold. His parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents had built the business up for over a century, and he completely destroyed it within a couple years. Story 44. The dude that destroyed Polaroid, still in prison. Yeah, let's quit making instant film. Our big thing. Luckily, a smart dude bought the machines for scrap pieces and re-engineered the product. Thanks, Dr. Caps. Then, in 2017, they were able to buy back the Polaroid name after 8 years of amazing chemists recreating the film and worked on the old intellectual property to make it better. Story 45. The most classic example is a guy called Gerald Ratner, who was CEO of his company's jewelry business. The shops and products were popular despite being tacky. He gave a speech in 1991 where he said, "We also do cut glass sherry decanters, complete with 6 glasses on a silver-plated tray that your butler can serve you drinks on, all for $4.95. People say, how can you sell this for such a low price? And I say, because it's total crap. After the speech, the value of the Ratner Group plummeted by around $500 million, which very nearly resulted in the group's collapse. Story 46. I'm surprised nobody has mentioned P&O ferries here in the UK. broke the law, and admitted to such in Parliament, by sacking almost 800 crew with no prior consultation to do so, only to rehire crew members via an agency as a cost-saving measure. This became so well publicized that there's even a Wikipedia article on the subject. Gross. I refuse to use them at all now. Story 47. A family member of mine blew up her life, including her company, by becoming a raging alcoholic/abusing drugs. Being a violent, paranoid drunk certainly doesn't help keep clients. She had self-medicated for decades. It's not the first time her addiction has blown up her life. In a span of 4 months, she ruined her company, ended up homeless, ruined her relationship with nearly everyone in her life, and caused her to have to move to a new city because she managed to piss off so many people. She got sober after nearly dying in a hospital. She spent a few weeks in a medically induced coma. She wasn't expected to pull through. I actually went and started to make arrangements under the guidance of doctors saying she was likely to pass. I guess that was a wake-up call. She's not the first person in the family to ruin her company/life with substance abuse. Story 48. In Australia and New Zealand, there was an electronics retail store called Dick Smith's. Mr. Smith got in early in 1968, and his company ended up in a dominant market position. Hundreds of stores with thousands of employees, and Dick Smith's Electronics was a household name. It was a major employer of students. Many a university grad helped pay their way by working sales at DSE. In 1980, Dick Smith's was sold to Woolworths Group, which expanded and modernized the stores, updated the books, and rebranded a couple of times. In 2012, Woolworths decided to sell Dick Smith's and concentrate on their core business of groceries. With challenges like Amazon and sales picking up, it needed bold new management to move the company forward into the new age. Instead, it got a vulture capitalist. Enter Anchorage Capital Partners, ACP, who appoint CEO Nick Abood. ACP then conducted the largest private equity heist in history. In 2 years, they would burn a decades-old, well-trusted brand to the ground and piss on the ashes. Here, as they say, is how it all went down. ACP begins by agreeing to buy Dick Smith's for $115 million. They pay the first part of a down payment with $10 million of their own money, and then promptly raid DSE's operating cash reserves for the rest of the down payment. They then go through the books and mark everything down. Any assets are sold off. Entire inventory stocks are depreciated. This lets ACP start a fire sale. Tons of stock at unbelievably low prices. Top-end laptops that normally sold for $2,000 were going for $400. Of course, the sale is a roaring success. ACP uses the profit from the sale to finish paying the Woolworths Group, and then gives themselves the rest of the money as a dividend payment. However, now DSE is left with empty shelves, and there's no money to buy replacement stock. Undeterred, ACP then embarks on a new strategy: take it public. With the roaring success of the fire sale as a baseline, the company report looks incredibly rosy, and with a little finagling of the books and just a touch of loan fraud, the future prediction looks just as good. ACP takes the company public in 2013, and under a year later has divested themselves fully of the stock, withdrawing entirely just days before the quarterly report is due. From a $10 million investment, Anchorage Capital Partners walks away in 2014. 20 months after the purchase, with $520 million. And then the new owners find they're holding a lemon. There's no operating cash, no stock, no assets, no plans. The business limps along through court cases and class action suits before folding in 2016, leaving thousands out of work, many of them young adults in their first jobs, and investors out of pocket. Liquidators come in and find the shell of the company is almost completely barren. ACP, to this day, still considers Dick Smith's as one of their success stories. Story 49. The one that comes to mind first is John Antico, the Blockbuster CEO who famously chose not to buy Netflix, who insisted that brick-and-mortar stores were the future and Netflix and Redbox exemplified a fad that wouldn't last, and ignored the advice of expert consultants hired to specifically give advice on the situation, who insisted getting in on the ground floor of digital would be the best way for the company to stay relevant. From a titan in the industry to bankrupt within a few short years, all stemming from a single decision. When in doubt, pander to convenience of your average consumer. Most people would much rather stream shows and movies from their own home than get up, drive to a Blockbuster, rent out a movie, drive back home, Play the movie, watch it for the weekend, and then run it back to the store. I mean, just when you break it down like that, it certainly doesn't make any sense, that decision to not get in on Netflix when it was just starting. Story 50. A friend of mine worked for a computer services company. You could call them if your computers were busted, and a genuine top flight expert would show up with a shockingly complete set of tools and spare parts to get you going again. It wasn't cheap, but they would fix it, whatever it was. Some companies would sign a service contract, pay whatever a year, and then they would get 2 free visits per month. They still had to pay for parts. The company started with 2 people, grew into 24 in a couple years, making money, and everyone was happy. The founder hired some guy with an MBA whose first act was to require all employees to sign a non-complete contract. It stated that for a period of 5 years after leaving employment, you could not work in any capacity with computers anywhere within 500 miles of the company's HQ. My friend showed it to his lawyer, who said only a complete idiot would sign that. A new MBA said that anyone who didn't sign was fired. About half the employees quit and started their own company that week, stole nearly 3/4 of the old company's customers within a month. The original company closed a year later. The founder and his new best buddy, MBA, were both convinced that the result proved the non-compete contract was necessary. Neither ever understood that they created the result they were trying to avoid. Story 51. Family businesses are very susceptible to this problem. Either there are no heirs, the heirs don't want anything to do with an otherwise profitable company, or the heirs are, my dad owns a dealership, frat bros who can't learn how to operate the company. In this case, the idiot heir just drove the company into the ground. What's interesting is the relationship between size and how fast a screw-up can tank the company. The equipment rental companies just came and got their stuff back right away. But look at Sears and Kmart. They've been liquidating their business for the last 15 years at least, and no suppliers have cut them off because there's a layer of corporate abstraction. For those who don't know, Sears and Kmart were the size of Amazon and Walmart combined today. The entire U.S. middle class shop there. They own thousands of stores outright. When you're that big, no supplier is going to risk losing business by demanding bills get paid. So yeah, you can have a 15-year liquidation sale. Medium business? Forget it. 1 month of bad cash flow and the vultures come picking.